Conquerors, explorers, traders, and settlers, Vikings had a massive impact on medieval Europe. But first, let's get the stereotypes out of the way. We think of Vikings as ferocious fighters in horned helmets, but most of their fighting was done with axes, swords, and spears. And while we think of them as wearing those iconic horned helmets, most didn't. Only the elite warriors and those who could afford it wore helmets, usually made of leather or chainmail. Even the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066, shows Vikings wearing fairly simple 10th century style helmets. Let's clear up some more misconceptions. While many Vikings did raid and pillage, only about 10% of them were what we might call mercenaries or professional soldiers. Most Vikings were farmers or traders. In fact, the word Viking actually means pirate or raider. It was a term used by the Scandinavian people to describe the 10% of their population that went abroad to seek their fortunes. And where did these Vikings go? They went everywhere. From the late 8th century, Viking raids swept across Britain, Ireland, France, and the Mediterranean. Their targets were monasteries, coastal villages, towns, and trade centers. They chose these locations because they were usually wealthy and had poor defenses. Monasteries were particularly popular because they contained both valuables and vulnerable victims. How did the Vikings travel all over Europe? They used advanced shipbuilding techniques to construct longships, fast, shallow draft vessels that could sail both seas and rivers. This allowed them to strike far inland, surprising their victims and confounding their enemies. Because of their speed and mobility, Vikings often struck suddenly, looted what they could, and retreated before any organized resistance could arrive. So what did Vikings actually do in battle? They relied on their weapons and armor, not brute force. They carried axes, swords, and spears and fought with round shields. Most wore simple leather armor, though wealthier Vikings wore chainmail. But what really made the Vikings terrifying was their psychological warfare. Their brutality and reputation for violence created an aura of fear around their name. They would attack holy sites like monasteries and churches to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. Over time, some of these raids turned into settlements. The Danelaw in England, Dublin in Ireland, and Normandy in France are just a few examples. These settlements were often established by Vikings who had been exiled or displaced from their homeland. But not all Viking activity was forced. Many Vikings willingly engaged in trade. They traveled throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, exchanging goods and making money. In fact, some historians argue that raiding was actually part of a broader Viking economy. By preying on the riches of monasteries and trading centers, Vikings were able to acquire goods that they could then sell to merchants. They were also skilled craftsmen and produced high-quality goods like jewelry and weapons that they traded throughout Europe. As time went on, the kingdoms of Europe got wind of the Viking raids and began to prepare. They built fortified towns, maintained standing armies, and even developed navies of their own. As a result, Viking successes became less common by the 12th century. Though gone, the Vikings left behind a rich legacy. They influenced medieval warfare with their tactics and technology, including the use of the longship. They inspired awe and terror throughout Europe, and their descendants would go on to become some of the most successful explorers and traders of their age. So remember them not just as fierce raiders, but as skilled mariners, explorers, and settlers who helped shape the world.